Good evening. My name is Lisa Syward, and I'm delighted to welcome you all. I want to take a moment and introduce you to the InterReligious Institute at CTS, the IRI. We are a new initiative that began last fall, and we grow out of a long-standing commitment and history of engaged interfaith work at CTS. The IRI was created to help us deepen and reimagine the work we've already been doing. And it is a joy and an honor to put my energy into the Institute and serve as the project director. I'd like to especially recognize the Henry Luce Fund, whose generous support and belief in this institute provided the seed money for us to launch. I'd also like to extend gratitude to individuals, foundations, and families who have made significant contributions and commitments to our work, some of whom are in the room this evening. And finally, I want to especially acknowledge two groups of people who are playing a crucial role in our work: the IRI Steering Committee here at CTS and our External Advisory Council, which is co-chaired by Carol Siegel and Susan Thistlethwaite. Both of these groups provide guidance, direction, and support to our efforts. We are also blessed and supported by Rachel Mikva, who serves as our senior faculty advisor. And I'd like to ask those of you in the room, Rachel, Carol, and other members of the steering committee and the advisory council to please stand for a moment so we can recognize you. The IRI develops programs and opportunities for CTS students, for the wider CTS community, and for the public. This first year, that has included a number of exciting initiatives and partnerships, and we have more on the horizon. You have a flyer in your program about our upcoming RiotCon conference, Beloved is a Verb, where we will take on the work of challenging Christian privilege and resisting anti-Muslim bias. I encourage you to attend if you are able, and to please share this opportunity within your networks. It promises to be an important transformational event where we can learn with and through one another to equip ourselves to move toward the change we so need to see. I am very grateful to welcome Dr. Reza Aslan as our keynote for our first IRI Winter Lecture. Dr. Aslan is a member of the CTS Board of Trustees and also serves on the IRI Advisory Council. I am thankful for the many ways he shares his insights and wisdom and will help to guide the IRI as we grow. I want to share with you that personally, I've been involved in significant ways in interfaith work for almost a decade. But over the course of the past 18 months especially, it has become clear to me that the efforts we've engaged in, our partnerships and our alliances, they haven't been enough. We as a society are becoming more divided and more fractured. Religious intolerance against Muslims and other minority religions is on the rise. We need new ways to come together to insist that we are better than this, that we can create a world that celebrates diversity, that sees and affirms our shared humanity as the basis for society, and refuses narratives that affirm some and exclude others. We need new understandings of what it means to be in community, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a citizen of the world. We need to create an unbreakable force among us that resists practices and policies rooted in fear, that are focused on building walls, policing boundaries, and telling us who counts as worthy and who is dismissed and discarded. The IRI is dedicated through public lectures, through supporting the creative efforts of our students, through research, through service opportunities, through community engagement, through our willingness to ask hard questions and seek fresh answers, we are dedicated to forging paths that lead to mercy, justice, and love, creating communities rich in diversity and pluralism, grounded in fierce respect for one another, resisting the rhetoric and politics of fear, oppression, and division. We believe a different world really is possible, and that working beyond lines of difference is key to its flourishing. And so I invite all of you to become more involved in our work. Join us at our RiotCon conference, where we are working to actively be the beloved community. Follow our updates, share our news, come to future events. Set up a meeting with me and share your ideas. Find places we can collaborate, opportunities to strengthen one another. And if you are able, please make a donation to support us financially so we can keep deepening our work. Your donations support our ability to offer programs like tonight's lecture with Reza Aslan. They are allowing us to develop a track in Muslim studies here at CTS, to create a podcast about interreligious issues, to be a significant presence at the upcoming Parliament of the World's Religions, to interrogate and experiment with models of engagement, to do the work that leads to communities grounded in religious pluralism that affirm we are all beloved children of the divine, that stand up for one another without hesitation, that create communities rooted in love and compassion and solidarity. I thank you again for being here tonight, and I appreciate your presence and your energy and your collaboration and your prayers.
Your program will tell you that I am Stephanie Buchanan Crowder. I am not. I am Rachel Mikva, and it is my honor to introduce Reza, who doesn't really need an introduction. So that part in your program, that's fake news. The rest you can believe. That program will tell you that Reza Aslan is a world-renowned scholar, and that's true. One who helps us to think anew in fresh ways about things that we just always imagined we understood. Like, of course we know about Jesus, of course we know what we think about God, but helps us to sort of think about how these figures, how these ideas, how these beliefs play out in human history and draw a thread through so that we can understand it in a whole new way. So he's a best-selling author. We're expecting God to creep up. It's got a good title. It will creep up there too, I think, quickly. The program also tells you that he won the James Joyce Award. I didn't know that one. That one really impresses me, Reza. But it doesn't tell you that he was about his turn as a TV personality in putting together this very creative series called Believer. I hope some of you saw them. But I want to talk about Reza in a different way. I want to talk about what Reza means to this institution and introduce him that way. Because he's famous around here not only because the students and the faculty and the board and the community, we love your work, but because you saw something special in us. You saw a spark, and of course when you nurture the spark, it turns into a fire for leadership in theological education, in interreligious engagement, in bridging the divide between academia and activism, in figuring out why we're learning these things so that we can go out and do. And Reza helps us believe in ourselves in this way because he believes in us too. And so he shares his time, his teaching, his passion, his insight, on our Board of Trustees and in events like this where we can share those gifts with the community at large. So for all of that, we are extraordinarily grateful. So please welcome, with all the love that we have, Reza Aslan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. That was Stephanie. That was so nice. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to whoever purchased this podium from the set of Game of Thrones. I'm grateful to be here. I love this place. I love the Chicago Theological Seminary. I love being here. I love being on the board. I love doing these kinds of talks. I think this is the 4th time that I've had the opportunity to speak to the community in this way. It's a marvelous and fantastic organization. It's a light in this dark, dark times. And by dark, I mean dark orange. And I'm just grateful to be here with all of you. Let's talk about God, shall we? Let's talk about God. I like doing this kind of stuff. Let's start in the beginning. That's where we will start. There are, as many of you in this room know, many, many stories of creation in the long and intimately linked history of religions. There's one of my favorites, the story of Atum, the world finisher, the creator god of Egypt. He spent an eternity drifting along the primordial waters of creation until he finally settled on a mound called the Ben. Since he was the only being in the universe, he masturbated into those waters, which, just so you know, gentlemen, is the only time you should ever masturbate, when you are by yourself. Not sure why that needs to be said now, but apparently it does. He masturbated into the primordial waters, and out of that arose the great gods of Egypt: Isis and Osiris, Nephthys and Set. In some myths, the creator is a kind of artisan or a craftsman of sorts, somebody who literally fashions something out of nothing. This is Napi, the creator god of the Blackfoot Indians. Napi was thought of as an old man who traversed the length and breadth of the world, gathering up the mountains with his bare hands, scooping out the valleys and the rivers and the oceans, planting fields and meadows and forests with his tools. Sometimes in these stories, creation happens completely by accident, often as the result of some kind of, whoops, what happened? There we go. Some kind of, hey, that's Nappy. Some kind of divine sexual union. That's what I'm trying to get to. When Apsu, the god of fresh waters, and Tiamat, the goddess of the oceans, merged in body and soul, they birthed the first generation of Mesopotamian gods, who were called Lahmu, or mud, and Lahamu, or silt. Often, the creative act first requires an act of destruction, some kind of primordial murder or sacrifice out of which the universe arises. The most famous version of this is Fanku, the creator god of China. Fanku was born in an egg-shaped universe. Inside the egg was no thing, but inside no thing was Fanku. He was born, he burst out of that egg as a giant covered in hair. And then with his chisel, he began to separate the earth from the sky. The earth became yin, the sky became yang, opposites yet interdependent. And then when Fanku died, his skull became the dome of the sky, his blood became the rivers and the seas, his bones became the mountains and rocks, his breath became the winds, his death rattle became the thunder. And then there are those creative myths in which the act of creation is deliberate. when a lonesome God sitting on some kind of cosmic throne gives voice to a thought. Let there be. And then just as suddenly, there is. But what all of these creation stories have in common, regardless of how they understand the act of creation itself to be envisioned, what they all have in common is that they are based on this fundamental belief that human beings were created by the gods and in the image of the gods, whether to serve them or to love them as equals or as slaves, with delight or with regret, accidentally or on purpose. Whoops, there we go. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. I've been studying the religions of the world for most of my adult life. And I can tell you with as much certainty as anyone can bring to this kind of topic, that whether you believe in one God or many gods or no gods at all, this one thing is true. It is not the gods who fashioned us in their image. It is we who have fashioned the gods in our image. In fact, the argument that I make in this book is that the entire history of human spirituality can be viewed as one long, interconnected, ever-evolving, and remarkably cohesive attempt by human beings to make sense of God by giving God a name and personality, by giving God human attributes, human weaknesses, human desires, human virtues, human vices, even a human body. In other words, by transforming God into a human being. Until, of course, in the person of Jesus, God literally becomes a human being. Now, I want to make something clear here. I'm not implying that there is no such thing as God or that God is just a human invention. Those things may be true, but I have no interest in that conversation at all. I personally do not find anything edifying or any real value in trying to either prove or disprove the existence of God, because there is no proof either way. And anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to convert you. You can just ignore that person. Faith is not a rational thing. Stop pretending that it is. Faith is an experiential thing. It is fundamentally an emotion, like any other emotion. Like love. You either love someone or you don't. What I'm trying to say instead is that when you look at the sort of long history of human spirituality, what you notice there is that there has been this kind of one overarching symbol for the way that we think of God. One grand metaphor that sort of supersedes all the other metaphors in our religions for how we try to make sense of the incomprehensible, how we try to express what is fundamentally inexpressible. And that metaphor is us, more specifically, Morgan Freeman. In fact, I mean, that's kind of what I think of when I... In fact, more often than not, whether we're conscious of it or not, regardless of whether we're believers or not, what the vast majority of us think about when we think about God is essentially a divine version of ourselves. A superhuman being, but with human attributes and no human limitations. Now, this is what I really want to talk about tonight. Because the thing that's really fascinating to me is that it turns out that we have very little choice but to think this way. That we are evolutionarily adapted to humanize the divine It's a function of our brains. In fact, if you go all the way back to the very origins of the religious experience, you'll see how the very process through which the concept of God arose in the first place compels us to conceive of God in human terms. Again, whether you actually believe in God or not. Now, obviously, when we're talking about such things as the origins of religious experience, we're talking about delving deep, deep, deep into our evolutionary past. And of course, the further back you go, the foggier things are. And so this is it's a conversation it's difficult to have. There's an enormous amount of debate about what religion is, how it arose, why it arose, when it arose. But these questions about what spurred ancient human beings to believe in spiritual beings is one that has been around for a very, very long time. Did the religious impulse arise as part of our evolution? If it did it give us some kind of advantage in our quest for dominance over all the other species on Earth? Was our species, Homo sapiens, the first species to exhibit the religious impulse, or could it be found in earlier species of human beings? What's undeniable is that the religious impulse reaches deep into our Paleolithic past. But again, just how deep remains a matter of fierce debate. And the reason why it's such a fierce debate is because in order to answer this question, usually what we do, what scholars or anthropologists, sociologists, archaeologists do, is that they rely on material evidence. In other words, we go and we dig something up out of the ground. It looks like it might be religious in nature, and we date it, we interpret it, and then we make some sort of grand conclusion about what that says about the history of human spirituality. Now, here's the good news. The good news is we have a lot of stuff. We have dug up a lot of things, and we can use those things to come up with some plausible answers around which at least there is a fair measure of consensus in this, as I say, very fraught debate. I'm going to take you through some of this stuff. A, because I think it's cool, and B, because I think it'll really help us to sharpen why I say what I say about this thing about how we have this unconscious impulse to humanize God, that we can't help it. So I want to begin, first of all, with the idea of temples, right? And the reason I want to start with temples is because they're the most obvious manifestation of some kind of religious activity, right? Some kind of ritual or ceremonial activity. What you're looking at here is called Gobekli Tepe, or Potbellied Hill. It's in southeastern Turkey. This is a remarkable find because this is, as far as we know, the oldest temple ever to be discovered. It's about anywhere between 12 and 14,000 years old. Now, that's about 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It's about 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramids of Giza. In fact, it's so old, it actually predates the rise of agriculture. So that means that this gigantic, magnificent structure, which stretches about 1,000 square feet long and 1,000 square feet wide, was built by nomadic hunter-gatherers who had yet to invent the wheel. And yet, as you can see by this artist's rendition, you can get a sense of the scale of this. It is composed of about 20 individual sections. I think I have is that a real, do I have a thing? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Can I point at that? Oh, look at that! Okay. It's about 20 of these different structures. Most of them are circular, some of them are oblong, some of them are spiral. Each one of them has at the center these two megalithic T-shaped pillars that you can see right in the middle of them. What's really fascinating about this is not just how old this is, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but about what those T-shaped pillars are. You see, we know for certain, I mean, a fair measure of certainty that you can bring to something that's 14,000 years old, that this was meant specifically as a place of ritual, as a religious temple. Why do we know that? Well, we know that because absolutely no evidence has been found that anyone lived anywhere near this structure. Usually, when we find a structure of this size, this magnitude, what we find is homes and hearths, the evidence that people lived near this thing. No one lived near this thing at all, which makes us think that the only reason that it existed is as a gathering place for people, a gathering place that must have had some kind of ritualistic or religious significance to it. People must have come from miles around, people who worship different gods, who probably spoke different languages, who probably had very little in common with each other except for this temple. And so they must have used some kind of universal symbol, some grand metaphor that drew them all together to this spot. And again, we have a pretty good idea of what that metaphor is. You see, those T-shaped pillars are not just pillars. They're actually stylized human beings. We've dug enough now to see that they have hands. You can see the hands crossing in front of them. Some of them have loincloths and belts. Some of them are wearing jewelry. Whatever they are, they're clearly meant to represent some kind of abstract humanoid figure. More interestingly, by the way, is that we know that we've discovered lots of pictographs that cover these big pillars. It's clearly meant to be some kind of writing, though there's literally no way for us to ever know what that writing is. There's no real possibility right now to actually interpret it or translate that writing, but it clearly looks like writing. And the dominant theory is that the writing is either a description of each of these deities, these humanoid, abstract humanoid deities. Perhaps it's about what their use is. You know, which one of these do you pray to and for what reason? Perhaps it's about the myth of each one of these deities. We don't know. We have no idea. What we do know, however, is that even at this point, right, even when we go to the earliest sort of universally recognized temple, you all at that point already had this notion of the human figure being merged with the divine. Now, I start here because the truth of the matter is that we have temples that are way, way older than Gobekli Tepe. It's just those temples are underground. In fact, one of the most profound and oldest symbols of ancient religiosity that we have is precisely in the spectacularly painted caves that dot the landscape of Europe and Asia, but which frankly can be found as far afield as Australia, as Indonesia, even here in the United States, though clearly the ones in the US are much, much newer. A lot has been written about these caves and the images that are found inside. One of the probably most dominant theories about these painted caves is that they represent a kind of hunting magic. And I'm sure you've probably heard this, right? That sometime in our deep ancient past, our Paleolithic ancestors would go into these caves. They would draw an image of an animal. They would, in some way, focus their intention upon that image, and somehow that was supposed to help them go out and then hunt that animal. That's been the sort of prevailing theory about what these caves mean, really, since we first found them. That theory, however, has been more or less abandoned among archaeologists and anthropologists because there is no evidence to back it up whatsoever. First and foremost, there is literally no correlation. We have never found any correlation whatsoever between the animals that are depicted in these caves and the bones of the animals that we find in the hearths that essentially fed the artists themselves. There's no correlation between the animals they hunted and the animals they depicted. The great anthropologist Levi Strauss kind of put it really nicely. He said that these primitive humans chose the animals that they cast upon the rock, not because they were, quote, good to eat, but because they were good to think. In fact, there is almost never any sign of any violence in these caves at all. The animals are never represented as hunted or killed or pursued in any way. In fact, there's a number of images that have been used to sort of put forth this sort of hunting magic theory, images in which we see these animals with lines crisscrossing their bodies or their flanks, and that has routinely been understood as images of spears, perhaps, entering the body. But we now know, through further analysis, that those lines are not entering the body, they're emanating from the body. And so what they truly must represent is the animal's aura, its essence, its soul, if we can use that anachronistic term. And in fact, even more interestingly, most of these animals are sort of unreal. They're not painted in a very realistic way. They're often at these odd, impossible angles. They're often shown in movement, but there's never sort of any landscape for them to move upon. There's no trees or grass or ground or bushes. They are just kind of often hanging in midair. And some of them aren't even real animals. Some of them are mythological animals, animals for which there have been no evidence that these particular species ever existed. In many of them, at least 70 cases that we have found so far, the animals have merged together to create a completely new being, or, more interestingly, they are therianthropic animals, meaning that they have been merged with human elements. And there's lots of examples of that, of drawings in which sort of the animal and the human have combined to become one. So clearly, whatever was happening in these caves was far deeper than just hunting magic. In fact, further evidence indicates that the caves themselves were created in such a way to elicit a spiritual response. That it's not so much the drawings on the cave, but literally the cave itself that represents the sacred, the ritualistic. We know this because it's often the case that these animals are not drawn in sort of flat, easy to see, easy to reach areas like you would expect. On the contrary, they are more often than not deliberately put in these sort of curves or around bends or in difficult to reach places where you can only see them if you are standing in a very specific spot in the cave. In fact, new analysis of some of these paintings has shown something extraordinary. We have noticed many, many times, you've probably seen this, you can see it right here, look, where you see sort of animals that look like they are superimposed on each other. Or perhaps it looks like an animal was drawn and then erased and then a new animal was drawn on top of it, or what have you. And we've never really been able to understand what that was all about. recognize this for a moment. Our ancient ancestors entered these caves with nothing but firelight. They walked through these caves, again, very deliberately, point to point, with each section having a very specific function, kind of like the Stations of the Cross that you would see. And so I'm going to show you this in a minute, but when you walk through these caves, looking at them with firelight, what happens is that the animals start to come alive. One researcher has now put this to the test. He is taking the various drawings. This one is in Lascaux. And he has shown what it would look like when you move through it. This is from Les Trois Frères in the southern Pyrenees. Essentially, whatever was happening in these caves was an attempt not to paint the world that they knew, but to imagine a different world, a world that's beyond our world. In fact, what's really amazing is that not only did they it's not the case so much that they drew those paintings on the walls as they sort of released the paintings from the walls. Oftentimes what they did is they would use cracks or crevices or curves in a rock as the starting point, that it would look like an antelope's thigh, and then they would make it into an antelope. Whatever was happening here is an indication of a spiritual exercise. The oldest of the caves that we have in Europe, the ones that we know were created by Homo sapiens, go back to about 40,000 years ago. So that's just around the time that Homo sapiens first set foot in Europe. But here's what's wonderful about this, is that we have now found caves on the remote islands of Indonesia that look exactly like the caves in Europe, painted in the exact same style. Different animals, of course, but painted in the exact same style, that are also 40,000 years old. So that means one of only two things. Either this is a skill, an impulse that Homo sapiens took out of Africa with them before they split, or there's something else going on here, that impulse is deeper. It's not learned behavior, but it's a kind of behavior that has some kind of unconscious impulse to it. But it gets even cooler than that, because about 4 or 5 years ago, we found a cave in southern Spain that showed a group of seals essentially descending a stalagmite column. And that was dated to 43,000 years ago. So that's before Homo sapiens entered Europe, which means that they were painted by Neanderthals. And even more interestingly, that blew everyone's minds when we dated that. Last week, we dated a new discovery in southern Spain, a group of painted caves that has now come back at 65,000 years ago. That is 25,000 years before our species arrived in Europe. So this is clearly a trait, whether it is unconscious or not, that our ancestors' cousins, the Neanderthals, themselves also had. And by the way, if the idea of Neanderthal spirituality confuses you, it shouldn't. We have plenty of evidence for Neanderthal spirituality. In fact, just in 2016, hold on, there it is. Just in 2016, in France's Aveyron Valley, we discovered this altar inside a cave. And this picture's not great, I admit, but you can't see the scale of it, but let me tell you what you're looking at. So these around here are dozens and dozens of broken stalagmites that someone took off the cave and then rearranged in a group of concentric circles, in the center of which is an altar. Again, you look at that, and it clearly represents some kind of ritual behavior. This was dated in 2016 to 176,000 years ago. What this shows is that our prehistoric ancestors, not just Homo sapiens, but certainly Neanderthals, had a vibrant spiritual life, that they expressed that in very clearly defined ways. And that part of that expression involved this notion of a sort of different world, right? That there is the world for our senses, and then there's this other world. The best example that we have of that other world comes, of course, in the form of graves. This is a treasure trove for scholars trying to figure out ancient spirituality, because we have so many of them. Burials are really, there's no need to interpret whether a burial exhibits spiritual behavior, because the very fact of burying the dead is a spiritual act. There is literally no reason to put a body under the earth at all. In fact, it's an enormous waste of resources and energy, both of which should be used to survive. But not only did our ancient ancestors go through the trouble of burying their dead, they did so with deliberate ritual, often bearing with them trinkets, weapons, jewelry, necklaces, things that may have been dear to the person when he or she was alive, things that they would have needed in the next life. And in fact, that's exactly what these burials represent, a fundamental belief that this isn't it, that whatever we are, that there is a part of us that's eternal, that's immaterial. The word that we use for that now is soul, but there was a fundamental understanding of this way back then. In fact, one thing that's really fascinating is that we have found that in many of these ancient caves, the bodies were buried and then disinterred, and then the head was removed, the brain was scooped out, and sometimes the brain was consumed. We're assuming by the sort of family members. Why? Because it seems as though our ancient ancestors thought that the brain was the seat of the soul, and that by consuming the brain, you were essentially taking in you a piece of the soul of the departed. The oldest Homo sapien burials that we have are about 120,000 years old. We have Neanderthal burials that go back even deeper than that. There is a burial that still remains in an enormous amount of controversy and debate. You know it as Peking Man, the burial that was found in China. And that burial, which again shows to me and to many, many other scholars unambiguous signs of ritual behavior, though because it's so old, it's hard to be certain about it. That burial goes back about 500,000 years. Now, what this indicates so far is that, at least going back a couple of 100,000 years, we have evidence for the belief in something that we can call the soul, and evidence for the expression of that thing, both within these caves and in large temples like Gobekli Tepe. But there's even more. One of the most sort of spectacular finds that we have made over the last 100, 150 years or so has to do with what we refer to as the Venus figurines, which is an unfortunate term because these figurines are tens of thousands of years older than the invention of the goddess Venus, but they were all found by white Europeans, and they're all female figurines, and so they just call them all Venus figurines. But that's how we refer to them. These are idols. They're quite clearly idols, carved from stone or wood. They're anywhere between 40,000 and 20,000 years old. As with the other things, that there is a little bit of controversy about whether these figurines should be considered religious items. The truth is that the vast majority of scholars believe that they are. There are still some scholars who think that they're not. In fact, there are a number of scholars who believe that what we are seeing here is nothing more than prehistoric porn. Let me tell you, all of those scholars are men. Okay, there is no woman archaeologist who thinks this is just prehistoric porn. And we know it's not, because while it is true that they're all female, they're all almost to a figurine, pregnant females. Round, distended bellies, plump breasts. Some of them, like this one here at the very top, unfortunately you can't see it, have little niches carved in them, and we have seen the evidence of resin in those niches, which means that they must have burned some sort of incense in them. Many of the Venus figurines, this is the Venus of Willendorf, it's about 29,000 years old, have either faces that are left uncarved or that are deliberately veiled in some way. And the traditional interpretation of this is that that's because they're meant to represent womanhood or womanness instead of any specific woman. But it is unquestionable that these are representative of some kind of ritualistic thinking. What you're looking at here is my absolute favorite of these Venuses. It's called the double Venus of Garibaldi. It's sort of affectionately referred to as Beauty and the Beast. And the reason that you're looking at this, I got a better shot of this, but I just want you to look at it in this point, is that this is actually two figures. On one side, you have the traditional Venus figurine, face left uncarved, breasts have unfortunately broken off, and a distended belly. But as you can see at the head and the legs, this thing is attached to some kind of beast, some sort of serpentine horned monster. And here, actually, this is a much better view of it. You can see a 360 view here. So you can see where they connect, right? There's the Venus and there's the monster. You can see it and you can see the distended belly here. You can see the breasts much more clearly here. And more importantly, you can tell as clear as day that this was meant to be worn. That's why the hole is there. That if anything, what you're looking at is an amulet or a talisman of some sort. Again, once again, showing this sort of notion, this merging of animal and human. This is not the most famous example of that, nor is it really the oldest. The most famous and oldest example is the Lowenmensch. This was found in southern Germany many, many, many years ago. What you can see here, this is carved out of wood, is that this is a human being with the head of a lion. Lowenmensch is just German for lion man. Here's the cool part, is that for about 30 years, that's what we thought this was. And now that we've finished constructing it, we know that it's not a man, that it's actually a lion woman. Although the scholarship is yet to catch up on that part yet. So the Lowenmensch is about 40,000 years old. The double Venus that I just showed you earlier is about 26,000 years old. Here's why I wanted to show you. This is called the Barakat Ram Venus. This was found in Israel not that long ago. It's exactly what you would expect. kind of what we've seen so far. It's in this case, it's a hunk of rock that's clearly been deliberately carved. You can see the carving lines. There's the legs, there's the belly, the breasts have fallen off, the head. It is very much the same sort of idea that we've seen all this time, one of these Venuses. But what's astonishing about this is that it was recently dated to at least 300,000 years ago. That is 100,000 years before we existed as a species, before there was any such thing as Homo sapiens. So again, all of this, I could do this all day, by the way. This is like my most favorite thing in the world to do, if you haven't noticed. I could do this all day. But here's the problem, right? As you've noticed in my telling, every time I give you a date, I have to change it again, because guess what? We found something new. And then every time I tell you that, it's like, oh, but we found something new, actually more than that. And oh, actually, it's not a guy, it's a girl. Here's the problem with material evidence when it comes to trying to figure out the origins of the religious experience. And that is that ideas don't fossilize, right? Beliefs can't be buried in the ground and then dug up 100,000 years later. And in any case, it's ridiculous to think that because the Barakat Ram Venus is 300,000 years old, that the belief that led to its creation is also 300,000 years old. That's not how it works. People believe things for tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of years before they get around to actually carving those beliefs into stone or out of wood or painting them on a wall or building something to reflect it. It's absurd to think that an idea and the physical expression of that idea arose at the exact same time. And so this brings us to this kind of vital truth, this sort of problem in this entire conversation about where belief came from, why it arose, and how, which is that we can't look to the material evidence to answer this question anymore. And that's becoming increasingly understood. That instead, perhaps what we should be doing is not looking at the thing itself, but looking at the brain necessary to make that thing. And this brings us to a vital truth about the religious experience, the religious impulse, one that we just can't ignore. And that is that religion is first and foremost a neurological phenomenon. Whatever the religious impulse may be, however it is defined, it is ultimately a function of the brain. It is a function of complex electrochemical reactions. Now, let me be clear about something. The proper response to someone telling you that faith is the result of electrochemical reactions in the brain is, so what? That's the proper response. Everything is the result of chemical reactions in the brain. Everything. Every experience you have ever had, every emotion you have ever felt, every reality that you know. This conversation, your being aware of me being here, me being aware of you being here, everything without exception is a product of complex electrochemical reactions in your brain. So why wouldn't faith also be a product of electrochemical reactions in your brain? Why would the religious impulse be different? Those people, particularly the sort of new atheist radicals, who say that, well, now that we know the chemical reactions necessary in the creation of the religious impulse, we don't have to take religion seriously anymore. We know the chemical reactions involved in the expression of love. So then we don't take love seriously anymore? Does that mean that love is not a legitimate emotion? Does it devalue the expression? Does it delegitimize the object of your affection? Of course not. And remember, we started this conversation by saying faith is an emotion, just like love is. So it's not a big deal to say that religion exists in here. Of course it does. Everything exists in here. Everything. But here's why we're talking about it. Because what it means is that if we truly want to talk, if we truly want to talk about the origins of the religious impulse, if that's a conversation that we want to have, then we need to stop looking out there and we need to start looking into here. Now, I talk at length in the book about sort of how the brain is the source of religious experience and what that means, and I don't really want to get too deeply involved in that conversation here because we'll be here all night. But I do want to say one thing that's very important, is that what this sort of demonstrates and what is no longer arguable in any real or meaningful sense of the word anymore is that religious belief, however it's defined, is so widespread, it's so universal that it cannot be considered in any other way except as an elemental part of the human experience. What I'm trying to say is that we are fundamentally, whether we understand it or not, homo religiosus. That whatever religion is, whatever the impulse towards fate is, it exists in our brain. It's embedded in our cognitive processes. It's part of who we are. This desire, not for creeds, not for doctrine or dogma or institutions. That's not what we're talking. We're not talking about religion. We're talking about the religious impulse. But we're talking about the striving for transcendence. The fundamental belief, which is universal, which exists in all cultures, all peoples, all parts of the world, throughout all of time, which, if the material evidence is any indication, predates our existence as a species, that we are more than this, that there is something else. Substance dualism is the term that philosophers use, and we now know, thanks to the work of cognitive scientists and psychologists, that understanding of substance dualism, the belief that the mind and the body, and by the way, you can replace the word mind with soul if you want, you can call it psyche if you want, you can call it Buddha nature if you want, you can call it chi if you want, doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it Brahman if you want, it doesn't matter what you call it, it means the same thing. That the mind and the body are separate and distinct. It turns out that's a belief that we are born with. Studies of children across this planet, regardless of whether they are from a religious family or not, have shown that we are born with this intuitive understanding, that it's unlearned. And so this brings us to this kind of fundamental evolutionary puzzle, which we're not going to get to too deep in my talk. We can certainly talk about it in our conversation, which is why? Why? If religious belief, the religious impulse, as I've been calling it all this time, is a universal phenomenon, there must be a reason for it. There must be, to put it in scientific terms, some kind of adaptive advantage for it. Otherwise, why does it exist? There's no reason for it to exist. For the better part of about 200 years, sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists and every scholar that you can imagine has been trying to answer this question. And there have been a number of answers given. The truth is that all of those answers have fallen short. The fact of the matter is that we just don't know. The answer is we don't know. We don't know why this is a universal impulse. Because the fact of the matter is that there is no adaptive advantage to it. That's what most evolutionary biologists have concluded, that there is no reason, that if anything, it is an extreme disadvantage. Again, going back to, in terms of time, resources, energy spent on expressing the religious impulse, all of which would be better served focusing on survival. We don't know. The answer is we don't know. Cognitive scientists have more or less come up with a consensus answer, which is that it's just an accident, that it's a byproduct of some other evolutionary adaptive advantage, some other thing that happened in our brains that was necessary for our survival, carried with it, as a total accidental byproduct, this universal impulse, this universal belief in what we will now refer to as the soul. That's a pretty good answer. And I, again, outline exactly what those different evolutionary adaptations are. It's a pretty good answer. We don't know. There's no way to prove it. It's a pretty good answer. I think an equally good answer is that it's just how we are. It's just how we're made. It's just who we are. That we are meant to think in multiple dimensions, that we are meant to know intuitively that we are more than just our material selves, that the reason it's embedded in our cognitive processes is not just because it's some echo of some other function, but that it is the point, it's the purpose. Again, that's also unprovable. None of this is provable. That's what faith is all about. But it's up to you which you believe. Here's what I'm interested in, and this is where I kind of want to end this conversation, and why I took us through this very long journey. Whether you believe it's an accident or not, whether you believe it's deliberate and purposeful, and this is how we are and how we were made or not, whatever. There is one very important consequence of this fact that all of what we are talking about exists in here. And that is precisely how I started this conversation, which is that it compels us, consciously or not, to conceive of whatever that other is, God, the divine, whatever, however you want to define it. It compels us to conceive of that in human terms. It compels us to use ourselves as the lens through which we understand the other, the divine. To construct God, essentially, using the only thing that we truly know, which is ourselves. To make a God who looks and thinks and acts and feels and loves and hates just like we do. To make ourselves the image of God, in other words. Now, the benefits to this unconscious impulse, I think, are pretty obvious. Partly it has to do with the fact that if you're talking about God, you're talking about something that is so beyond human comprehension, by definition, so utterly unhuman, that the only way to make sense of it is to humanize it. And also because it allows for precisely the kind of deep connection that we want from our spiritual experiences. This is partly why I think that Christianity is the most successful religion in the world, and will likely continue to be the most successful religion in the world. Because of all the major religious traditions, Christianity is the one that allows you to fully succumb to this unconscious impulse, right? The way that I describe it is it allows you to scratch the cognitive itch. Because what Christianity says is, God isn't human-like. God is literally a human being. Do you want to know what God is? Imagine the most perfect human being. Perfectly kind, perfectly loving, perfectly compassionate, that's God. Everyone in this room can do that. And so you can understand the enormous appeal of that notion, of that message. Give in to it, because it's true. But it also has consequences, right? That's the good part. The bad part is that obviously when we start to construct a God in our own image, what we end up doing is we give that God our biases, our prejudices. We make a God who hates what we hate and who loves what we love. We make a God who literally looks like us, who has our skin color, who has our politics. And this, more than anything else, explains why religion can be and has been a force for both good and for evil, because whatever is good and evil about our religions is just whatever is good or evil about us. So in the great tradition of CTS, I'm going to end not with a conclusion, but with a question. And that is, should we struggle against this impulse then? Should we try to stop thinking this way? Should we dehumanize God in our spirituality? Do the benefits outweigh the negative consequences? I don't know. What I do know is that it is a question that every one of us is compelled to ask. Thank you. Okay. I think, Christophe, we're going to do a little Q&A. I'm sure there's no questions or comments, right? That was it? Everybody, let's just go home? Yeah?
So I'm going to travel with the microphone here. So do we have any questions? We've got two here.
Thank you very much for such an interesting talk. One of the last things you said made me think about Robert Bella's Religion and Human Evolution. And I noticed in the talk, maybe in the book is different, that you didn't define religion. And I think that's relevant for the question, because in Bella's account, there is a connection between religion and play.
That's right.
That explains some of the evolutionary need, maybe, of religion and play as a way to kind of disconnect from the everyday experience. So there is, at least in his take, this is almost 10 years also, maybe there are new discoveries, that there is a reason that may explain both play and religion. And then maybe if you can comment on that, and because of that connection, where do you see the difference? Is play a form of religion? You know.
So I do cite Bella in the book. So his thesis is that the origins of the religious impulse come from this conception of play, and he says play is itself a universal impulse. It exists in all cultures, in all time and space, and so as a result, the concept of play, as it becomes more formalized, becomes ritual, and then ritual leads to religious expression. It's a good theory. I personally don't ascribe to it. Fundamentally, here's what's at stake. So there is a major dividing line among scholars when it comes to the origins of religious experience about whether those origins begin with ritual or whether they begin with myth. And fundamentally, here's what the argument is. There are those, mostly sociologists, following Durkheim, who was the first to kind of come up with this idea, that said that religion has nothing to do with spiritual beings at all, that that's not how it began, that we performed certain ritualistic behaviors, rituals that had some kind of necessary, perhaps even adaptive function, and that eventually those rituals, as they became more and more formalized, required a kind of script to make sense of them. That script is what we now refer to as mythology. Ritual, myth, married together becomes religion. So the origins of religion shouldn't be seen in any kind of spiritual activity at all. It's a mundane ritual activity that acquires spiritual significance. So there's a sort of an entire class of scholars who follow that line. There's another class of scholars, mostly anthropologists. This goes back all the way to, Tyler and, Mueller and those guys, who say, no, religion began with myth. That what first happened was these stories that in some way or another helped give meaning to the experience of life, right? They answered these sort of enigmatic questions. Those stories then, in order for them to actually have any real significance in the lives of people, to be more than just stories, had to be enacted in some way. And the acting out of those myths is what created rituals. Myth plus ritual equals religion. Who knows? We literally have no idea. Either one of those two things could be true, and it's really a matter of your discipline, about which one of those two things that you accept. I am far more a mythologist, but either way, what I'm trying to argue for is it's a paradigm that sort of is above either of those two views, that rejects the dichotomy and says, you're asking the wrong question. Because long before there was myth or there was ritual, there was a brain capable of conceiving of either. And you have to start with the brain. In general, though, let me just say one quick thing about what you had said about defining religion. Yes, you're right, I did not define religion. As most of the scholars in this room know, we study a discipline without definition. It's weird. There is literally no accepted definition for religion inside the study of religion. And so we are all forced to just kind of come up with our own working definitions, the ones that we like, and then we use that to create our theories. If you're interested, my working definition of religion is very much reliant on the work of anthropologists like Levi-Strauss. I think of religion as a form of language. So I say religion is a language made up of symbols and metaphors that provide a community, it's a communal experience, the opportunity to communicate with each other and with themselves this ineffable experience of faith, the religious impulse. The religious impulse you are born with. Again, all the evidence that we have, all the psychological and cognitive evidence that we have is that whatever this thing is, you're born with it. That it's something that you unlearn, in other words. Again, why? It doesn't matter. We don't know. So there's no reason. It doesn't have to have a spiritual significance, but it's a fact that we're born with it. And so to me, what religion is the attempt to express that feeling. So all of my definitions are language-based. Thank you for that question.
Hi, I just want to say, actually, this is my second time seeing you speak in the past couple of years, and I'm just really excited to be here right now.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm actually, now I'm thinking, I don't really know how to phrase this question. I guess in Islam, we're taught that God is inherently unknowable, right? He is divine. The reason we call him a he is because Arabic is a gendered language. There's really no better way to talk about him. So with that, with me in particular, being raised Muslim, going to Muslim schools, spending kindergarten through 12th grade, studying the Quran, what advice would you give me as someone who still struggles with that fact and, like you said, the itch to kind of, humanize God?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that's really fascinating about Islam is that it is, among the world's religions, one of only a handful that rejects the notion that God created humans in his image. right? Which is interesting. There's only a very few creation myths that reject that idea, and Islam is one of them. And certainly, Islam's, attempts to not anthropomorphize God are probably the thing that people know most about Islam, the idea that God cannot be expressed in figurative form or understood in human terms, that in and of itself is shirk. It's the greatest sin in Islam. Something very similar to this, of course, exists in Judaism, which also strives very hard to not anthropomorphize the divine. Both religions do a terrible job of it. Both. A terrible job of it. Now, partly this has to do, again, with the innate unconscious impulse, that we don't have a choice in the matter. But partly it has to do with this fundamental fact, which is that it's impossible to talk about God unless you use human language. And human language is about symbols and metaphors. And so if you're going to construct a narrative in which God is involved, then you almost have no choice but to anthropomorphize God. You have no choice but to have that God act the way that you would act in whatever that situation is, whether it's in the midst of a great, debating a great flood, or whether it's at the beginning of creation. When you put God into a story, he becomes a character in that story. And then he starts to do things that humans do. He acts in human ways. He expresses human emotions. He's described in human terms. And so even the Quran, as people know, has numerous passages in which you hear about God's hands or God's face, or, there are many anthropomorphizing expressions of God in the Quran. Now, again, the proper response to that is, well, it's poetic, that it's just metaphor, that it's not supposed to be taken literally by any means. The problem, of course, is that most Muslims don't do that because of a whole other aspect about what the Quran represents as God's speech, again, an anthropomorphizing expression, that the sort of idea is that you have to read it in a quote-unquote literal way. And so all the great, theologians of early Islam, all the great jurists and legal scholars, when confronted with this, contradiction at the heart of Islam's conception of God, that he's utterly unhuman, but he has hands and a face, and those kinds of things, the response is, it's a mystery. It's just how it is. The Quran says God has hands, therefore he has hands. But again, that's the definition of shirk, right? It's the definition of the anthropomorphizing of God. It's the definition of limiting God. How many hands does God have? 2? Why not 3? Why not 1,000? Why not 1,000,000? Is saying he has 2 hands limiting God in some way? Right? Now, these questions may sound absurd, and they are absurd, but their absurdity comes from this refusal to acknowledge that Scripture is not meant to be read the way the New York Times is meant to be read, okay? It's not a book of facts. It's a book of truths, and those things are not the same thing.
And we're going to take one more question here.
Thank you. I really appreciate bringing things down to the lowest common denominator, so I like that. Well, I want to push back on one comment that you made at the outset, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I've studied the cosmological arguments, and right in the beginning I'm like, no, because one thing you said is that there's no proof for the existence of God. And as someone who has spent a considerable amount of time studying all the arguments for the existence of God, I felt like I would have a question for you, because you showed us all these images of all these, paintings and figurines, etc. And every time one was discovered, it was also assumed immediately that there must have been a human being right there to make it. And just as when we find things in the world and that we expect would come from, we don't just think that they just showed up there and that there was a human being that made it, even though we didn't see that human being and didn't meet that human being. And somehow I think that is a bias when we see a whole world which is really magnificent and fantabulous, and we would assume that nobody made that. So I guess my pushback is just on why would you insist that there's no way to prove either way? And
Prove or disprove.
yeah, especially since we, just that fact that when we see a thing, we assume that there was a human being that made it.
Yeah. I think in some ways, I appreciate your question, but I think in some ways the answer is embedded in your question. I mean, the thing is that faith is a point of view. It's a mode of knowing. And so if you are a person of faith, you know differently than a person without faith. And everything that you see as proof for the existence of the divine, someone who doesn't share your point of view can easily see as proof for the non-existence of the divine. And the fact of the matter is that the question itself, I think, misses the point, right? And I'm not saying this in some sort of touchy-feely way that, faith is about what is unseen. That's not true. But I do think that it's important to move away from the argument of is there or is there not a God, and instead have what I think is a far more important argument, which is, what do you mean by God? Right? That's my response to everyone who tells me they don't believe in God. Every person who says, I don't believe in God, I say, what do you mean by God? And then they do what we all do. They start to describe a divine version of themselves. And then I say, I don't believe in that God either. So that's the only thing that I would say. Can I just say one thing, Christoph? I feel like we ignored this side. Can we just get one question from this side at least? And then that'll make me happy.
Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar.
Thank you for doing this. I'm gonna be real quick. Actually, I'm just gonna say this real quick. I feel safe asking you this question. You seem to be one of the sort of scholarly religious celebrities without an ego. So I'm
one
gonna
of
ask you this.
Two,
Yeah.
I think. Yes.
But real quickly, I just want to say, I did enjoy your talk, but it seemed to focus a lot on sort of like whiteness. Like the God that, I learned about in Sunday school. So I just want to say that wouldn't it be nice if we could have visited Africa prior to the atrocities that happened and see how they viewed God?
Yeah.
Because this whole thing about the mind and the body being separate, that's a Eurocentric thing. In my humble opinion, I lived in Africa, and most of the gems that were left, it seemed like the mind and body were one. So, I don't know, you kept saying we now know, but I kept seeing France and all these other places.
Right.
So I'm just,
Europe and
curious,
Asia.
is there any study or interest in looking at, spirituality in Africa prior to, the horrible colonialism and imperialism, and also, and also, when you talk about unplugging, in this country, God is white. So, I'm just throwing that out there.
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you, brother.
4 years ago, I came here and I gave this whole talk about Jesus and about the ways in which Jesus is understood and seen around the world. And I showed, I think, maybe 10 or 12 images of Jesus all over the world, in Thailand and in Kenya and in Ethiopia and stuff. And precisely the argument was, in each one of those situations, Jesus looked exactly like the people who drew him. And that's just again, it's part of that cognitive impulse that I was talking about here. And so we do that, right? We think of God, when I say as a divine version of ourselves, I mean the same shading as well. To your point about the issue of focusing on Europe and Asia, you're absolutely right. We've done the oldest religious artifact that we have found was in South Africa. It's about 120,000 years old. It's this very interesting ochre box. So what we know is that a lot of these bodies that we have found buried were dusted in red ochre. And so the idea is that the color red probably had some symbolic significance, perhaps the color of blood and life, but also the dusting of it was supposed to, think of it as kind of a lubricant for the other world, for entering the other world. And so the oldest religious artifact that we have found is a red ochre box with some symbols on it in southern Africa. And while it is true that every one of these species that I talked about started in Africa, the archaeological finds in the continent are very few. Partly that has to do with the fact that many of the regions that are the richest in material evidence are also very difficult when it comes to archaeological digs and things like that. Part of it has to do with the fact that it's so much older, right? Again, Homo sapiens arose in Africa 200,000 years ago. They didn't get to Europe until 40,000 years ago. And so whatever they built, whatever they constructed on the continent, and whatever that tells us about ancient human spirituality, either it's been lost because of the damage of time, or it's just not been found yet. And will hopefully, when it does, supplement the little knowledge that we have about these ancient belief practices. But you're 100% right. I mean, this is, these are white people doing the work, doing the studies, white men. And so part of the goal of, a contemporary scholar is to always read past that necessary bias and to try to get as much of an objective analysis on this evidence as possible. Again, that's another reason to stop focusing on the material evidence. It's useful and interesting, but this doesn't matter what color you are, right? This doesn't matter what race you are or what your ethnicity is. We are all born with the exact same brain functions, and those functions are where ultimately the answer, if there is an answer, ultimately the answer of why exists. Thank you, everyone. Nice to talk.
Contemporary porn. Thank you, Reza, so much for, again, provoking us to think about things in new ways. Thank you to everyone who made this event happen. Thank you to all of you who came out. If you would like one of Reza's books, they are, I think, already signed, and you can buy them right outside. We hope that you will come to future events here at CTS, especially events that are sponsored by the InterReligious Institute. If this is one of your interests, we look forward to partnership with you as we build out the work and the relationships that are so central to the InterReligious project. And if you want to help make events like this happen, I'm sure there's somebody outside who would be happy to take your donations or to talk with you about how to partner with us in the future. And I would like to send you off with words from the Jewish tradition. Baruchim atem bevochem, baruchim atem b'tzetchem. You were blessed in coming here. May you be blessed as you go forth, as you are sources of blessing.